This episode of the Sacred Playgrounds podcast is thick with analogy. We're talking about the handoff between this summer season and this fall season in particular, how we hand off from the ministry that happened this summer to the ministry that's happening in homes, in congregations, on campuses as we move into this fall season. Welcome to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, where we dive deep into theology, research, and practical wisdom for camps, retreat centers, and other key ministry spaces. I'm your host, Jared Rendell, camp enthusiast and part of the Sacred Playgrounds team. This podcast features Dr. Jake Sorensen, a scholar and practitioner who's helping leaders think more deeply about outdoor ministry and the impact it's making. Wonder with us what God might have in store at your Sacred Playground. Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. Here we are at the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. We're on season 2, episode 2. How are you, Jake?
I am doing quite well, Jared. I am enjoying the beginning of the fall weather here. It's always my favorite season of the year. How about you?
Yeah, I'm good. My wife, fall. Well, I mean, it's a battle between like fall, like pumpkin spice season and Christmas season are on equal standing up in this house. Like I think I mentioned before, her like she's written a couple books, and that those are what they're around. It's pumpkin spice season and Christmas season.
It's so funny how people get so uptight during these different seasons, right? Like they're either for pumpkin spice or they're like dead set against it.
So
and they're
polarizing.
they either love Christmas or they're like, it's too early, stop singing Christmas songs already. People get upset about funny things.
They do. The holiday loyalties are strong around here, that's for sure. So, I mean, right, you said it's the beginning of the fall. This is the time when the summer is kind of handing off to the fall. It's like a baton pass. You guys are track folks, right? Like your wife does some track coaching. You've done some track coaching before, and
yeah, I coach every year. I was a relay guy when I was in track myself. And so, yeah, that's a good metaphor. The handoff. I like
you're
that.
A pro at the handoff.
It's a transition of seasons, but the seasonal transition is really slow, but we want there to be a more seamless handoff in terms of the transition from summer camp to the fall seasons. We don't want there to be a gap in there, because like in track, I'm going with this analogy. All right. In track, there's that exchange zone, and you've got to get the baton passed within that exchange zone.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't, then, I mean, you're disqualified for the race, in the case of track. But, like we don't need to talk about disqualification, but we need to talk about serious consequences if you don't get the handoff done in a specific period of time. And so I think that's a good metaphor to lead us forward into our discussion today.
Who you pass that baton to, if it gets dropped or not, all of that really makes a difference for the outcome of the race, right? So every camp person wants this. Every camp person, as much as we love camp, we don't want camp to just be a summer camp high. We love it. We enjoy it. But everyone would agree that the point is that we incorporate this into our lives, that we incorporate these experiences, that we incorporate our connection with Jesus and with each other into the rest of our lives. Right? That's the point. We want people to go home, and we want people to we want a difference in their faith lives.
Yeah, we're building disciples. That's what we're doing. That's what we're in the business of. And a lot of these camps, you look at their taglines and they're talking about life change and things like that. Well, if we want to have life-changing impacts on our young people, we can't just expect that to happen in a single week. The experience has to extend a lot farther than a single week at camp, or in the case of summer staff, a single summer. There has to be continuation, and there needs to be a handoff to those partners in ministry. And that's really what I want to talk about today, because if we want to accomplish our mission, if we want to accomplish our goals, then we need partners in this, and we can't think that our ministry is somehow a standalone ministry. And so In the effective camp project, we often talk about the different levels of outcomes. And so we talk about immediate outcomes that happen at camp, right? I mean, the kids are having fun. The kids are safe. They're in a safe space. Those are immediate outcomes, and you can celebrate those things. And we celebrate those during the week of camp. But then when we send the kids home, we want there to be impacts that continue. And so we start by calling those subsequent outcomes, right? The kid comes home from camp, they're more excited, the parent sees them happier, more joyful. That's a wonderful subsequent outcome. But those sorts of feelings of joy aren't going to last, right? Because emotions go up and down over the
Mhm.
course of weeks and months and our lifetime. And so when we get past the subsequent impact level, then we start looking at lasting impacts. And if we want to have lasting impacts on our young people, we need to focus on certain things in the camp environment, but we also need to work on follow up. And this is a perfect time of year to talk about it, right? Here we
Right.
are, shortly after camp got done. I mean, our campers are now transitioning into their lives at school. A lot of our summer staff are either at school or they're in the job market right now. And so, how can we make sure that these outcomes are lasting outcomes?
Yeah, and that's part of why the effective camp study for those campers. That's part of how we framed it, right? These touch points of before summer, end of summer, but then again, weeks and months later, to try to capture some of that. And same thing with some of the camp and church leadership project stuff with the summer staff. We're trying to look at down the road. Are there places that they're connecting, and then even the other direction with the clergy part of that survey to say, was this part of your pathway? How important was that? And so clearly there's a pathway, and clearly there were handoffs that did happen, and when those do happen, it seems like the data is telling us that's a good thing. That's when there's impact.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that are revealed in those projects. And, right on about the effective camp project. I mean, that's how we structured the methodology of the
Right.
project itself, to say not only, hey, did you have fun at camp or did you learn more about God, but what are your perceptions about the camp experience months later? And are any of those things that we measured during camp still present months after camp? And that's where we do that follow-up survey. And we've talked about this before on this podcast, that we've measured multiple impacts that continue months after camp. And so some of the clearest ones, I mean, so we've got things like self-confidence and social skills and things like that have been measured at all sorts of different camps. But when we're talking about faith formation, we're talking about things like religious practices and devotional practices. Kids praying more with their family, reading their Bible more, and wanting to attend church more. And so those are some of the things that last in the months following camp, along with this understanding that faith matters in life. My daily life, I can consider faith as part of that, and it becomes an integral piece of my daily life. So we call that faith relevance, a lot of times in our study. And this leads the young people over the course of months and even years that we've measured to seek out Christian community and to want to be a Christian, not just isolated and on my own, like a me and Jesus sort of relationship, but with other Christians. And that is a necessity of Christianity, right? We talk about the body of Christ. We talk about where two or three are gathered. Um, we need other Christians to sustain our life of faith.
It's interesting that one of the five fundamentals with effective camp, right, is that it is this set apart space. It's not like the rest of their lives, right? It's something that is set apart and special. But that implies, it's sort of obvious, but there is a rest of life. It implies that there is another space, a usual space, a home space that Jesus isn't absent from.
Yeah, when we conceptualize the camp model itself, we are taking people out of what they're used to, right? We're removing them from their normal cycle of dwelling, we call it, um, and embedding them into a new environment that has all the characteristics that we talk about, safe, unplugged from home, relational,
Mm-hmm.
participatory, faith centered. And then after that experience, we transition them back into their home environment. So we bring them out for this experience and then we put them back in. Um, and it's at that point where they are reintroduced or reintegrated into their home environment or their school environment or whatever their normal cycle is. that's where the impact happens. And so uh, we in the camping community need to be very aware of that and really start to think about how we can, using your metaphor again, pass that baton
Mhm.
to our fellow ministers. And those of us who are participating in congregational ministry, because both of us are very involved in congregational ministry as well, how then can we be the receivers
Mhm.
of those young people as they're coming back from camp, or the young people as they are transitioning into our college campus ministries? And so being proactive on both ends is really important.
So we're gonna spend this next little bit using our handoff analogy. We're gonna stick with it because like there are parts of that handoff. Both participants in that handoff are really important. What's actually, what's sort of on that baton? What gets held on? Why is this so important to get right? So we're gonna spend the next little bit. That's kind of the heart of this episode. Is we're gonna unpack this handoff. Talk a little bit about the why, which we've sort of started. The who, the where those places are, and try to get really practical to make sure we're doing that, because there are things both camp leaders and these partnered leaders, whether it's congregational ministry or campus ministry or other educational ministry, whatever it might be, so that we are taking a step right now to do that, to make those connections, to both be a giver and a receiver of that baton. So as we hand off from kind of camp life to the rest of life, there's some how we do that. We'll try to get really practical here. Yes.
Yeah, let's do it.
I by the way, I in my head right now, because I think of things more and more visually. I have like chariots of fire running through my head with a handoff, like in slow mo right now, like dun 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 dun. That's what's going on in my head. That's the
You
rest of this
know,
episode. Maybe we'll just backdrop the music underneath
I was
there.
gonna say if we can get the rights to that music, I mean, that needs to be playing right now. It's playing in everybody's heads at least, you know. But if we
Yeah.
could actually play it in their ears, that'd be great.
So we've got a couple audiences, right? We've
Yep.
got, I mean, this is happening on a couple of fronts. We've got campers that are in the midst of this transition, and then we know summer staff are doing this too, right? Pretty much everybody's back in school now, so they're really in the midst of this. Some, church things or education things or campus things have started or are starting soon, and so they're right in the midst of this right now.
Yep, absolutely. So, let's start with our summer staff members, because these folks have been on my mind a lot. We did another survey of summer staff this summer. Just was in the midst of writing an academic paper on the Camp and Church Leadership Project, and noticing some of the challenges that these young people are facing, with some of the mental health challenges, and the not being sure about their vocation and their calling. And it's a crazy, unsettled time of life, where they're really trying to figure things out. And camp is one of the primary places of ministry with these young people. And so, how can we, as those who work in the camp community, support our summer staff, not just when they're on site, but now that they're away from the site? And so, the ongoing connection becomes really important. And I think of this in two ways, really. I think of this one in terms of ministry to the young people. Like, this is a priority. We need to make sure that we are participating in ministry with these young people who
Mhm.
really are facing some difficult challenges. So we want to be there to support them and to encourage them. And again, to hand off the ministry to others as well. And then two is maintaining this connection because we want them back. Like staff recruiting starts right now, folks. And so if you haven't started staff recruiting, it's
Amen.
time to really get that in your head.
Hmm.
And a big part of that is taking care of your people right now. So even those people who are probably not going to come back next summer, they are your champions. They're people that can connect their peers to camping ministry. And so one, do it because it's the right thing and it's ministry and it's part of what we do. It's part of your mission. And two, to feed back into your mission and ministry for next summer. So those are two very important reasons to do this. And
Hmm.
so how do you do it? Some of us have a ton of summer staff. We've got 50, 60, 100 summer staff. Some of us have a dozen. So it's a different scale when we think about that, but making sure that there's personal connection to each and every one of them. Sending mass emails is great. And I think it's important, to include them in, the
Hmm.
news about what's happening at camp. That's important. But these are young people that thrive on personal relationships. They need to know that they matter. And they're not going to know that they matter with sort of an impersonal mass email. or a, hey, could you please come back and volunteer for this? Of course, some people will come back and volunteer because they want to do that. They want to be at camp all the time. But what about those people that aren't as connected? Those might be the young people who are most in need. And so making sure that you have some sort of system where you're reaching out to them on the individual level. Maybe that's you as program director, assistant program director, associate director, executive director, whatever that is. Maybe it's a team of people where you're, if you've got a lot of summer staff to contact, that you really are just reaching out and checking in with them. Not, hey, are you coming back next summer? But hey, how are you doing? I care about you. And I want to be here for you. So making sure that they know that you are there to support them as a minister is really important, and checking in with them. And it takes time,
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the pastoral ministry. And in a lot of ways, when you're serving as a supervisor of these young people, you're also serving in a pastoral role. And so keeping them connected to that ministry personally is really important, but also keeping them connected to each other. So how can you facilitate connection between the staff members and making sure that people feel connected in that way? A lot of camps are doing this, right? They have some sort of an online platform, some sort of an app that they say this is a great space where you can share things with one another. But making sure that everybody's invited into that, and that you are being a facilitator of that space, not necessarily running that space,
Mm-hmm.
because you want to let the summer staff interact with each other as well, but making sure that that's facilitated. So if you don't have that in place, making sure something like that is in place is absolutely essential. So those two things are where you start with sort of the immediate ministry with the campers, with the summer staff, keeping them connected to one another and keeping that personal connection with the full-time staff at your camp and each of the summer staff members.
Yeah, those are a couple of key ways for you to kind of for you to be handing off that baton really well.
It's important to do it now, right?
Absolutely.
Because as soon as it gets to December, January, February, they know that you have an ulterior motive because you
Right.
want them to come back. I mean, hopefully they always know that, right? That's always there. But when you're checking in just to check in,
Yeah.
that really is meaningful. So please do that. But then also in terms of the handing off of the baton, to whom do we hand off the baton? How do
Right.
we
The
do
who is
this?
the first thing to identify, right? That's part
Yeah.
of it is we need to name some of the
Yep.
who that could be. And we know some of that because we've got some data around things like campus ministry, for example, right?
Campus ministry is the obvious one. Okay. So, we started with those two ideas in that, like, you don't have to hand it off entirely because you are still a minister, but you also want to hand it off to the fellow summer staff members to make sure that they're taking care of one another.
Right.
But then, in a very practical sense, handing it off to another professional minister is incredibly important. Campus ministries are incredibly powerful ministries that, I did a study with Raleigh Martinson several years ago about camping ministry in the Lutheran tradition. And, we found some amazing impacts on these young people that talked about campus ministry literally saving their lives,
Hmm.
literally, and then some other impacts on their life of faith and their connection with the church and so forth. And so just an incredibly important ministry that so many of our churches do. It's not just the Lutherans that do campus ministry, of course. The Roman Catholics have very strong campus ministries, but so do the Methodists and Presbyterians. And there's a lot of evangelical campus ministry groups out there that do a great
Mm-hmm.
job ministering with the young people as well. And so, how can you connect them with campus ministries? Well, first of all, you know where they're going to school. You know that, right? You have that list. And so, if they are in college or university, making sure that you personally, again, this is a personal thing, that you reach out to those campus ministers in those schools. If you don't know where to find a list of campus ministry people, every major denomination has a list. Okay, the Lutherans have a list of all of the Lutheran campus ministry people. The Methodists have a list of all their campus ministry people. And so does something like Campus Crusade for Christ and different things like that.
Right.
So um, Lutherans have a presence on most college campuses, not all, but our ecumenical partners would as well. And again, the evangelical groups are going to have those
Mm-hmm.
ministries present on campus. And so making sure that there's a personal connection. Hey, I've got 3 staff that are going to your school. And these are their names and these are their email addresses. And I want you to reach out to them and let them know that you're here and let them know that you want them involved because they would be great leaders. And that's the thing that we really need to communicate to campus ministry folks is that these folks are incredible leaders. They have gone through this crucible of a summer where they have been thrust into leadership roles. We call it experiential leadership rather than experiential learning because they're learning to lead by actually leading. They're learning the content of something like a Bible study by leading it and teaching it to somebody else. We call that experiential leadership in the summer staff environment. And so connecting them can also be a boon for the campus ministry and for those ministers. And so make those personal connections. It takes time, but it's so important and so worth it to make that handoff. And here's the urgency behind it. We did this study with summer staff, right? The Campus Church Leadership Project. Now it was limited to the Lutheran Church, and so it's limited in that way. But I would guess that these numbers are similar across other denominations. Here's what we found. Last summer in 2021, of those young people that served on summer camp staff and were also enrolled in college, less than half were participating in college campus ministry at all. So it was 56% that said they never participated in college campus ministry. That's whether they were at a state school or whether they were at a religiously affiliated school. And there were only about a third, it was 30% that participated frequently. Kind of that other 14% in there was like, yeah, occasionally I did it, or it was inconsistent. They went sometimes. But otherwise we're largely uninvolved. And so these are numbers that should be 75, 80, 90% of these young people who are working at camp should be involved in campus ministry in some way, shape, or form, whether even as just a participant.
To your point about the leadership piece a second ago, I mean, those are even less than 10% were involved in helping lead those things in some way.
Yeah. You would expect there to be these campus ministries that were just loaded with camp staff. And those exist. Yeah. So, I mean, we did this study of Lutheran campus ministry several years ago, and there are a lot of camp staff involved, but it's not the majority. It's not even close. And so, you really would expect there to be a lot more former camp staff serving in campus ministries. And this is an easy fix. It really is. It's about partnership and handoff. Yeah. And you just have to complete the loop. And then, of course, not everybody's in college, right? And so you've got your young adults that are not serving or aren't in college right now. Maybe they're in the workforce or they're living with their parents or whatever it is. Connecting them to congregational ministry is important. Okay. Yeah. So when you reach out to them personally, you know where they're living again. And instead of reaching out to a campus minister, you can reach out to a congregational minister and a pastor and help plug them into a congregation. And so it's not just about campus ministry. It's about making sure that every single one of them has that handoff. Yeah. And because it's helpful. You know these people personally. So really making sure that this happens is incredibly important for your ministry.
Well, and these congregational partnerships in particular are often potentially the strongest, right? Because it's multi-level, right? These are the same congregations that you might have campers coming from. Some might be across the country, sure. But there might be campers coming from there. You might have donors or board members or whoever it is. These are multi-level. These can potentially be, especially if staff coming sort of from those congregations and then back to those congregations, that's a strong partnership with congregations, and we'd all agree that's a really good thing.
And congregations love to have young people involved and involved in leadership, and so do pastors. And so, reaching out to these folks and saying, hey, I heard you worked at camp, and how can we use you? How can we plug you in? And not just like, hey, will you teach Sunday school? But what are you excited about? And how can we plug you in? And so from like the other side, if you're a pastor or youth minister listening to this, recognizing that there are those folks in your community, and they can be plugged into the active ministries of your congregation. Find out what their strengths are and what they're interested in, and plug them right in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose that can bring us to some of the campers too. That can bring us to some of the campers because that's obviously a really key connection point. We've been talking about summer staff so far, but some of those same spaces might be, and even to what you just exactly said, to plug in these folks that they spent, whether it's a week and their parents came and were there or whatever it is. Those are families that you want involved, heavily involved in what's going on at your church.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if we transition to talking about campers, you know, there's there are many strategies that you can use to, connect with your campers. My sense is that a lot of camps are probably better at staying connected with their summer staff. Handing off the campers becomes a lot more complicated because you might have 1,000, 2,000 plus campers that you're trying to connect. So how do you do that in a very personal way? It's difficult to do in a very personal way, right? You can do that in the camp environment, but right now they're not in the camp environment anymore. So whatever you taught them about, you know, handing off the ministry to a congregational ministry or the ministry of the home has already set in. So you do that during the summer. And so I really encourage people during the summer to think about that handoff. We've talked about this in the past, making sure that you're teaching faith practices that can be carried home, like family devotional practices, making sure that you're talking about the importance of congregational ministry and also using resources from the congregational ministry in your camp ministries. Okay, so that's during the summer. But now here we are after the summer. Okay, well, I didn't do that. Now what do I do? So many things you can do right now. One, you've got all the contact information for all of your families. Keep in touch with them. And this really can be a mass email. It can be, but provide them with specific resources. Provide them with devotional resources. Provide them with quick videos about camp from your camp people, maybe from the summer staff people to help them feel connected. I think of some of the strategies that people adopted during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I saw incredibly creative things about how are we going to connect with our families. Oh, let's do this. Oh, let's do this. Oh, let's do this. And people showed up to things like prayer sessions or virtual campfires where they would actually, the camp staff would be around a campfire and they would be filming it, and they would have people present online and they could see the camp staff, they could sing the camp songs and things like that. It's another way to connect. So there are different ways to connect virtually to a lot of your families. Connect them. One, resource them so that they can have the devotions and do them in their home. And two, do those virtual connections with the actual camp community. And so those are basic ways to make sure that there are some points of connection with your summer campers in the weeks following camp.
Yeah.
But to your point, about the handoff with congregations, there are strategies there as well.
Yeah.
One, what campers came from what congregations. If you've got a congregation that 20 campers came from, does the pastor know? Pastors don't always know who went to camp. But as a camp director, tell them.
Yeah. Yeah, you build your visit list right there. Your visit list, your contact list right there from those campers.
Here are the people from your congregation who came to camp this summer. That is a very simple thing for a camp director or registrar or whomever has that list to do that and to let people know. Pastors really appreciate that, because if they do something like a camp Sunday, then they know who went to camp and they can recognize those people. And that makes the experience of camp a part of the congregational experience as well. And so those campers then can share something in the congregation, and the pastor can know something like, oh, wow, 20 kids from my congregation went to camp. Maybe we should really start incorporating some of these things into the congregational ministry. And you as a camp minister can equip them. So we talk about the handoff. I suggested that you incorporate things from a congregational worship service into your camp worship service. Now hand it off the other way. And this is up to you, camp director. You have to resource them, because not everybody knows your songs. Not everybody knows your traditions or your prayers. But you know what? It's really easy with, the media that we have now to let them know those things.
Right.
They don't know a camp song? No problem. Sit down with your guitar and record yourself playing and singing a camp song and send it to them and say, here are the lyrics, here are the chords, and here's an example of how it's sung. Pretty simple.
It is. So to kind of put a bow on that, Jake, it seems like when it comes to both for sake of campers and staff, there's sort of two pathways here. One of them is this network based approach of a connection with this pastor, connection with this, and maybe it's using camp staff to sort of get in there, or just going through your list and making that connection. So there's this network based approach, this relationship based approach, and there's this kind of more blanket offering things with through a mass email, through the resources, through things like that. And it seems like both of these directions have value, both and because they meet in the middle at camp.
You should do both of them. Absolutely.
Do both.
Because when we think about campers, you're handing them off to two spaces primarily when we talk about faith formation. And those two spaces are the home and the congregation. The home is the most important. So impacting faith practices in the home is absolutely essential. And that's what you can start to do with some of the resources that you send. But also trying to connect them to congregational ministry is incredibly important. And you do that through personal contacts with pastors and youth ministers. A lot of our camps, the youth ministers will come with the church group, whether that be on a trip
right,
or a camp experience or something like that. And so, keeping in contact with them and resourcing those folks can be incredibly important too, because those ministers need support. And you are a fellow minister of the gospel, so keep in contact with them, keep those networks alive, because that will strengthen both of your ministries and it will strengthen the mission of forming disciples for Jesus.
As we work toward closer, Jake, it sometimes as we talk on these episodes, I think of crazy ideas that I've never seen before. And I thought of one now. And so I'm just going to say it out loud because
let's brainstorm.
What if, right? What if I have these what if ideas about camp all the time, but what if, well, let me say it like this. So we got something that we had actually never gotten before our kids are starting kind of Sunday school at a new church. And I don't know why our church, I worked at a church for a long time and we just had never done this. We got a personal email from the Sunday school teacher, from their new teachers that said, hi, we're so-and-so, here's stuff, here's some of the, the info and the calendar, but mostly we just want to tell you that we're excited to get to know your kids. Great. And some have done that, some doesn't. It was great. And that popped into my head right now because when you were talking about, and this is kind of where these two communities that both need to continue bringing faith into their daily lives maybe come together. What if cabin groups didn't stop after summer was done? What if we equipped these summer staff to connect by sending parent emails to the parents or a text message or whatever to the parents to keep that connection alive? What if they were sending these messages? Like, of course, we're going to send some blanket messages, but what if their cabin counselor in November said, "Hey, I was thinking about camp, and it was so much fun. What have you been thinking about camp? What kind of things have been really good for you over these last couple of months since camp?" If that connection, if we stop thinking about, like we do the end of summer, if that week wasn't over,
and we can do that safely.
Right?
We can create spaces that are secure for these interactions to happen, and so that they can be supervised, and so that we know, okay, it's a 19, 20-year-old communicating with these young people, but it's in a safe space. We've got all these apps that can be used for these things, and we can say, okay, it's happening at this time, and there's going to be a reunion for week 3 campers, that were in whatever your program's called, adventurers, pathfinders, whatever you call your programs at your camp, right? And that group can get together and interact. What a cool thing. And I tell you
Cabin
what,
lives on.
Like you think of something like the Christmas letter, that a lot of camps do this, where at the end of the week, the cabin counselor will write a Christmas letter to their campers, and those will be mailed out, at Christmas time, and they'll get a personal note from their cabin counselor. That's just using technology, right? So now we've got this virtual technology to use. This is one way to do it. You know what? we talk like this and we get ideas flowing. I'm wondering what other people are doing, because they're already doing some really cool things, and I would love to hear from them. And I would love for them to share it with one another. And so we've got some virtual spaces where they can share ideas with how they continue to connect with their summer staff, how they continue to connect with their campers. Start sharing some of these ideas, you guys, and learn from each other, because the ideas that we just suggested, those are suggestions. And basically we've been sharing admonitions like, you should do this, make sure you do this in some way. um, you are the creative people who are the practitioners working these problems. And so I'm excited to hear about what you figure out.
Mhm. All right, everybody. So two things to do. One, if for some reason you haven't actually hit subscribe yet, whether you came in through the website or you came in through wherever other space you are listening, we're a couple episodes in here, and so hit that subscribe button. Number one. Two, check the show notes, because in the show notes we're gonna link to a couple of those spaces that Jake was just talking about, and that's a spot that you can go. I mean, you can always send us an email or something like that, but to put it out in space where others can interact with it too, we'll link to a couple spots where you could put that idea out there. Say, hey, I was listening to this episode, and here's one thing that we do that's worked really well. We'd love to hear stuff like that, and like you said, others would as well. Thanks, Jake. I know you guys have got you've got track stuff this weekend, right? So
it's cross country season now.
hand.
Not to be confused with track season. It's cross country. Yes.
I wouldn't want to. There aren't batons yet. You're right. So happy running to you and your family, and to all of your race running listeners that we are doing right now. Good luck on your handoffs. Let us know how we can help, and we'll see you next time on the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. Thanks for listening to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. This episode was produced by me, Jared Rendell, and featured Dr. Jake Sorensen, lead researcher and founder at Sacred Playgrounds, LLC. Our theme music was written and performed by Taylor Wilson. You can find his original songs wherever you get your music. Learn more and connect with the Sacred Playgrounds team at sacredplaygrounds.com.